welcome to our panel discussion to launch the reader Unframed, Discovering Image Practices in South Asia. And we're very, very lucky to have Rahaab Allana, the editor of the publication, and Sandev Handy, curator MMCA Sri Lanka, with us. Before I get into their wonderful bios, I wanted to start by giving a little introduction to Art South Asia Project for those who are not aware of it already. ASAP is a UK-based arts education and development non-for-profit. We support initiatives to widen and deepen the engagement with modern and contemporary visual arts from South Asia, and its diaspora. ASAP works with institutions and individuals supporting selected research projects, publications, exhibitions, and events. We offer annual grants and facilitate access to wider knowledge networks in collaboration with expertise across the nations of Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka and its diaspora. So, first of all, the reason we're all here today, thank you so much, Rahaab, for putting out this wonderful reader. So Rahaab Allana, I'm just going to give you a little bit about his background. Rahaab Allana is curator, publisher at the Alkazi Foundation for the Arts in New Delhi. He's a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society London and was previously honorary research associate at the University College London. He has curated and contributed to several publications and exhibitions on photography from South Asia and its transnational histories internationally. And he serves and has served on the advisory committee or juries of various cultural fora, including the Pictet Award, as well as the editorial board of the Trans-Asia Photography Review at the University of Michigan. Rahaab is founder of the first app for photography or art from South Asia called ASAP Art, same name as us, and has recently guest edited 2 volumes, Aperture magazine in 2021 of photography from the subcontinent, and the reason we're all here, the first reader on image practices in South Asia, Unframed, which has been co-published with HarperCollins India and is available to buy already. His forthcoming edited volume with Tulika Books, Delhi and West Heavens in Shanghai is based on photography in India since the 1990s. So thank you so much for joining us, Rahaab, and welcome to Sandev Handy. Sandev Handy is a curator, artist, and art educator based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. He is currently the curator to the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Sri Lanka and is part of the artist collective at The Packet. His practice crosses fugitive pedagogies, Afro-Asian networks of solidarity, botanical and bureaucratic naturalisms, and the body and its relationship to technologies of power. Before I get into the questions and let our wonderful panelists speak, I will start with a few housekeeping points. So first of all, this session will take place for around an hour, and there will be time for questions after. Please stay on mute during the whole panel and including the questions. And if you have questions, please write them in the chat, and then I will read them out and Sandev and Rahaab will be able to see them. This session is being recorded, and if anyone has missed it or any friends wanted to join it, it will be put on our website in the next week or so. Finally, please note at the end of this session, I will be ending quite abruptly once I've said thank you, so please don't take it personally. All right. Well, so as Rahaab, you are the editor of the publication. Quite good to start with you. I wanted to take the title of your book as a basis for my first question, discovering image-based practices in South Asia. Like, is there such a thing as South Asian photography? And I'm taking your question from your book introduction. What do we really mean when we identify someone as a South Asian image maker?
Thank you, Mala, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Sandev, for being in this discussion with me and with us. I'd also like to thank, before I begin, preface my sort of thoughts by saying I'd like to thank ASAP, the Murmur series particularly, which is growing from strength to strength, and I've followed several, and I hope that it is certainly a module that I think is a distinct one for the arts. And it too, attempts to expand the very notion of South Asia and South Asianism. So I think there's something of a network there that we can exchange ideas on. And this is, as this is meant to be a discussion, perhaps we can get into that all together. Another sort of prefatory note to my comments will be to thank all the contributors, all 31 contributors to the volume of Unframed. Without them, this volume certainly could not have happened. And, you know, a lot of it was realized in one sense or worked on through the pandemic. So there were various challenges that each one had to encounter in a different kind of way. So I'm extremely, extremely grateful to all the contributors, and of course our co-publisher, HarperCollins, for powering through with the editorial, not to mention the editorial teams of the Alkazi Foundation, the copy editor, without whom this volume really could not have seen the light of day. So a lot of thank yous out there. And I think that's maybe a way to intimate to our audience today that no volume, you know, happens in isolation, as it were. These volumes that we have, or volumes that we've seen like it, as it were, related to art in South Asia, are produced through co-working, you know, networks and collaboration and participation. So a lot has come to bear, I think, in order to conceptualize what this volume on South Asia image practices is, and I distinctly call it image practices, because I wanted to sort of extract the idea of photography or visual culture out of their traditional coordinates and take it to the culture that we are now confronted with, even in this Zoom conversation, the culture of Zoom and screen culture, which is sort of, you know, distinctly manifested in the last 5 to 7 years in a way that none of us had really imagined. And so what is South Asia and South Asianism in this context, you know, must be pondered, and I think is sort of discovered. Identity is complex, I suppose. At one level, it belies much of what this volume puts forward. I kind of end the introduction with reference to our genetic code, to only say that that is a code that connects us all. So thinking about territory and spatiality might be discursive at one level, but certainly there's a lot more that binds us globally.
Rahab, you're on mute. Sorry.
I wonder how that happened. How much of what I said did you miss, or was it just now?
You stopped talking at what binds us globally, I think.
Well, yes, so indeed, what binds us globally, of course, is this very idea of, you know, the genetic code, as I mentioned, is something I end the preface with, the introduction with, and that is something that is far more distinct to us as human beings than the idea of territory and spatiality, though, of course, that has come to bear socio-politically and culturally, you know, in a distinct kind of way. So I think I sort of treat South Asia or Asianism as a fact of history with the establishment of SAARC countries, as it were, in the 80s. And then, of course, hold that in contradistinction to, at least, you know, belying the volume, the ASEAN countries that came to bear. But of course, what I'm looking at is a practice that filters across South Asia. So Myanmar is a space that I do address in this volume quite distinctly, as well as Bhutan, that remains, of course, elided in many of the art histories that speak of the region. Now, region and regionality is something, you're right, had a distinct meaning for me, because as a custodian of an archive that goes to the 19th century, the idea of borders is fairly perceived as something that diffracts and dematerializes our sense of unity rather than, you know, enhances it. Because, of course, the making of modern borders is something that happens well into the 20th century and is not the fact of an archive, which looks kind of beyond borders. And rather to, you know, what I take from that is the commitment of these artists, of these practitioners to their subject rather than the places in which they are based. And so that becomes a way to think expandedly about South Asia and Asianism. And of course, the idea of global and globalism and globalization, which Nancy Adajania addresses in her essay, looking at the Triennale of '68. And of course, the contingencies of it, the problems, institutional and otherwise, associated with it. But say, for example, I speak from where I am right now. And as I mentioned to you earlier, here in partially here in conjunction with the exhibition of Raza that opened at the Pompidou Center. And it's interesting how, if you go through the exhibition, you really see him being addressed or discussed as a global citizen, because of course he moved from India while his brother remained or went to Pakistan. He moved here in the 1950s. And of course, then he moved back in the 2000s, as it were, to India again. But as one goes along it, and I think it becomes fairly clear that at some level, there's also the distinction of his origins as that of a person from India. So in a way, I think one wants to at all times expand this very idea of identity and location, and at the same time, not do away with it. Because after all, the distinctness and the question of regionality is something that all of us constantly arrive from and address and perhaps go back to. And so even Bhagirathi's piece on the South Asian diaspora in the United States, I think is very reflective of that. And eventually what you realize is that artistic commitment then goes towards activist engagement as well. And so how do you also track or trace social movements as one way of thinking about all the things that have come to bear in the last 10 years, whether it's majoritarian willfulness or polarization, and sort of at a distinct level, the atomization of secular culture, which we're addressing. So, and for me, it does become a refrain when one is traveling to find places where I can engage with other individuals, colleagues from South Asia, because our own countries often have borders that don't allow or make the crossing very easy. So I think, what does one do in a situation where themes and testimonies require us to have an expanded notion of ourselves and our identity, but at the same time, discussing them and creating dialogue for them is not something we can often do in our own countries with ease. So as one goes about, thinking about the volume and the distinct sections that are in it,
Yeah.
All of these are questions that are raised intersectionally at all times. So is it resolved? No, it isn't. But is it a question, that constantly needs to be addressed and then deferred and then re-engaged with at all times?
Yeah, and we need to be these global citizens, but as we've discussed in previous conversations, we find our friends and we find our home through also embracing the South Asian identity and finding shared friends in different places where we can meet. And I know, Sandev, I'm sure you have some points you wanted to make about this too.
Yes, thank you, Mala, and thank you, Rahaab and Mala, for sort of inviting me into this conversation, and thank you to ASAP too. I think I'm coming into this conversation not particularly as a contributor to the book, but largely as a respondent, kind of sitting here in sort of an islanded space, but also curiously enough, the only islanded space in South Asia within which most of the rest of South Asia can travel to. So I think that kind of is sort of a fascinating place to be in. So I'm going to, I think, ground a lot of what I'm responding to here in perhaps certain examples of practices, both with the Museum of Modern Contemporary Art and sort of the packet. But I also wanted to perhaps start with a little bit of also maybe a philosophical provocation, which is, I think, in responding to what exactly a South Asian sort of image maker in general is and what they kind of could be. I'm reminded of the phrase coined by Ayesha A. Siddiqui, who's the editor-in-chief of the magazine called The New Inquiry. It's actually initially a tweet by her and then later developed into a phrase that eventually accompanied a superhero character that she developed called the anti-border android. And the tweet or the term or the catchphrase for that matter is, she says, every border implies the violence of its maintenance. Which can, and considering that in the conversation of even trying to answer the question of what is a South Asian image maker, I think it can put us in quite a hazy position. I think it's a fundamentally a provocation to first think about what exactly South Asia is, and then to think through what a South Asian image maker is. And one of the ways in which I'm starting to perhaps think about that I want to kind of put back out there is kind of located in the context of the work of the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Sri Lanka, which is a new museum. And our name specifically has the word Sri Lanka in it. So it is the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, Sri Lanka. But I think where sort of Ayesha Siddiqui's sort of provocation of every border implies the violence of our maintenance sort of throws up multiple sort of issues for us, particularly for a museum thinking about what does it mean to represent Sri Lankan visual culture. It's starting to throw up questions of what exactly Sri Lanka is. Our name in and of itself implies a kind of border. And one of the things that we are sort of thinking through with some future exhibitions is how to negotiate this kind of gulf between, I think, Rahaab, you were speaking about territory and spatiality, and how essentially this conversation between the local and the diaspora comes together, and how and the gulf that sits perhaps between those two communities or groups. And in that, I think we're trying to start to think about, to ask so many steps. Is if you are any less connected or part of the island, if your disconnection from it is based on your exile? If you are connected by negation of a particular space, does that make you any less connected to this South Asian island in particular? And I'm introducing this idea of sort of this whole conversation between diaspora and local, particularly think about exile as a fruitful place to start thinking about this question of what a South Asian image maker is. In that the possibility of having, not being ever able to fully answer the question of what a South Asian image maker is, or to answer, or to respond effectively to Siddiqui's provocation, I think is to occupy a position of exile. So first of all, I think to be South Asian is to be in exile, in as far as South Asia in itself is in exile to itself. So to talk about South Asian image making then, I think, is to talk about exile, whether sort of geographically, culturally, or emotionally. And I kind of want to leave it there at that particular point in many ways to start to even break down some of those questions.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I?
Yeah, go. It's fine.
Yeah. So, thank you, Sandev, and I think I really appreciate the fact that you bring up, institutional commitments and institutional responsibility, and how, in a way, one has to think of them as places, on the one hand, of restitution and sort of, recovering certain histories, but also the essential idea of repair that comes with the idea of creating new institutions, and whether that at all is going to be possible. And of course, who is the audience that is being addressed, after all, through museums and so on? So the very question of spectatorship, which kind of, in a way, belies much of what the reader is also addressing, is who is being looked at, who is being addressed, especially in a world that is very, very self-conscious and self-aware, in a sense, about self-imaging. And so that very question of borders and exile, of course, comes out through narratives also distinctly, which are partition narratives, which Saloni Mathur has talked about in the context of exhibitions that were mounted, of course, through time, through, the 80s and the 90s, and even the 2000s, thinking distinctly of my East as your West. And how does, an archive then play this role of being something that is dynamic, that deals with inscription and meta-inscription, that of course then allows us to think a little rhizometrically about questions of belonging, nationhood, nationality, which is the next layer that needs to be sort of, untethered to an extent from what we mean by identity at any given moment in time. And so, sort of taking from the reader, I mean, there were distinct sections that have now become, I would say, traditional somewhat in our thinking about how to address the wider field of art histories, or, let's say, visual anthropology, and thinking about, let's say, framing of the history of the contemporary, or modes of circulation, or cultural imaginaries that make us think about, kinds of representation or modes of representation, and then the methodologies, curatorial strategies that have been put in place in order to build, this idea of the collective knowledge that comes out regionally and spatially from time to time. And I think those are things I was extremely, excited about. The question of exile is interesting because one of the pieces by Savitri Soni talks about Pandurang Kankoji, the Gadar Party sort of cadet, you could say, who's traveling to Mexico and ended up living in Mexico as an exile, and who is distinctly, as it were, photographed and documented by the modernist photographer Tina Modotti. But his life, of course, the chapter is written by his daughter, who lives in Delhi right now, and she has a fascinating archive and collection. I'd like to really thank Savitri for putting this extraordinary piece together and updating it from other pieces as well. I think Pandurang's work did appear in one of the documentas. I forget exactly which one, but it's extraordinary in terms of what he has to say about coming back home and then leaving again to find that his home was always elsewhere, was always, not in the place of his, as it were, of his birth, but in the place that he chose as his home eventually, and that took him in. And that becomes important because coming back to the institution, it is always, I think, with a sense of what the archive is, what contemporary practice is, and what museum culture is, those coordinates by which so much of the discourse that is generated in this volume is mapped and melded together. And I think this is something that distinctly happens, especially with photography, because it is always holding in abeyance, but also, in a kind of distinct meld, the idea of the lyrical and the evidentiary. And so how does one deal with the poetics of what the image brings to us, but also the veracity of the documentary and reportage that it's meant to show us? I have, there are certain examples within the volume that also address this question of exile by referencing publications like This Place, and of course, image making around the West Bank that occurred through various curatorial projects that make us think distinctly about areas such as the Northwest and of Kashmir that are extremely, at this moment, subjugated in different kinds of ways. But then again, there's always something quite refreshing and also of a message in Azule's writing about our work as developers of that meta history. And one thinks of the museum as a benign space. One thinks of the archive as a benign space. But sometimes the veracity of it lies in what is said about archives, what is said about them in museums, what is allowed to be said in institutional spaces, and what is not allowed. And so, again, coming to the theoretical notions of Agamben about who gets to speak and who is allowed to voice their concerns, very much is sobering when one looks at even Azule's contentions of potential histories that could come out that never see the light of day. But I guess the work of these volumes is to create a sensibility around what's possible, not necessarily what is already out there, but what might be possible through collective participation.
I'd love to kind of think about kind of a combination of questions I'd already been thinking about, the importance, as you both mentioned, of the institution, but also of the archive to have the responsibility for these image practices and the importance of them to kind of break down these exiles. How can we think about archival approaches through Alkazi or also through like activist collectives like the Packet, but also the museum in Sri Lanka? How can we kind of think about this in terms of the work you're doing, and what would you both like to kind of contribute more in terms of the responsibility of the archive, but also it's like potential dangerous kind of collecting habit?
Well, Sandev, do you mind? Why don't you go ahead while I take a breather?
Oof, okay. how would I think about this? I think to think through sort of these approaches to collecting and thinking, I'm kind of, again, I think I want to essentially return back to the story of exile again, and what it means to think about sort of archival practices in South Asia. I think Rahaab, I've just been going through your book, and it sort of has this brilliant sort of compendium of essays in there. And I wanted to pull out two in particular, which is on one end thinking about the ways in which sort of there's a documentary and reportage being instrumentalized in particular points in time. So in the context of Sri Lanka, I think there's a fantastic Omar Khan essay in there where they're talking about sort of postcards and the production of the colonial, ethnographic, and naturalist sort of image making practices. Or if you even move further into the company schools or the tourist postcards, and even sort of the history of botanical illustrations in South Asia. And many of these are covered in the book, but in many ways, it's a sort of way of instrumentalizing a kind of reportage to represent or create or construct the image or the various kind of biopolitical images of what perhaps South Asia can be. And then we move a little bit later on to, I think, Anoli Pereira's sort of brilliant essay on sort of the 90s art trend in Sri Lanka and the Tirtha Artist Collective, and how that artist collective is in many ways sort of emerging in response to sort of a nation building project gone wrong, and emerging from the chaos and trying to respond to it. But in between there, I think between sort of the contemporary and the colonial, I think I'm quite curious. Sorry, I'm going about this a bit of a roundabout way, but I'm thinking about this in the context of sort of the 90s, 50s, and 70s sort of world building. And I think we had sort of talked about this a little bit, where sort of Sri Lanka and many other sort of third worldist Afro-Asian movements or post-colonial kind of solidarity come together and try to essentially construct this new world through a kind of translocal nation building kind of project. There's one really fast exhibition that I was able to look at a little bit more closely, which is the 1976 exhibition called the Viscom Creativity, held at the National Art Gallery in Colombo on the occasion of the 5th Non-Aligned Summit. And many such exhibitions were sort of held and facilitated at that time in the region. And I think if you start to look at these exhibitions and the catalogs that they're produced and the kinds of archives that are trying to be sort of, or let's say the images that are trying to be produced of South Asia in the larger context is quite fascinating, because it's not simply trying to frame itself as adapting to modernism, not even necessarily responding to modernism, but in many ways even claiming that the West didn't go too far enough with modernism, and instead frames itself kind of as modernist. But even through all of these three examples, I think I'm returning back to Siddiqui's question, even with Tirtha, with the sort of colonial productions, and with sort of the sort of nation building project image making practices that were happening there. In many ways, it still sort of is unable to fully answer or respond to the question of every border implying a violence of its maintenance. And in many ways, yeah, they sort of fail that question. And I think that's why I want to sort of return to this notion of exile, to think about what does it mean to not attempt to build these kind of shared archives, not attempt to situate yourself within the nation or within the border territory, but actually to explore something a little bit more specific, which is the hyperlocal and the kinds of things that can emerge from when one dives into the hyperlocal. At the risk of running a little bit too longer too, I think I want to share a little bit about this meeting that I read about, which is Edward Said meeting Faiz Ahmed Faiz in Beirut while Faiz was in exile from General Zia's rule. And in sort of continued engagement, Said sort of recalls Faiz and meeting up with a friend at a bar in Beirut. And I'm going to just read out what Faiz writes. Said writes. He says, the three of us sat in a dingy Beirut restaurant late one night while Faiz recited poems. After a time, he and Iqbal, the friend, who is also Pakistani and in exile, stopped translating his verses for my benefit. But as the night wore on, it did not matter. What I watched required no translation. It was an enactment of a homecoming expressed through defiance and loss, as if to say, Zia, we are here. Of course, Zia was the only one who was really at home and who would not hear their exultant voices. But I find that story really quite fascinating because it's three people meeting together. And at one point, there's this sort of deep hyperlocal connection being built where the language is switching to Urdu, there's an exchange that's happening. And Said is almost sitting outside of that. But I think there's a sort of a beautiful kind of archival, not an archival, but an intimacy being built there, where by virtue of experiencing or being witness to this sort of hyperlocal moment, Said is sort of experience a kind of solidarity, a kind of intimacy with that exile. And so that's why I wonder if this notion of the hyperlocal can actually be a kind of productive space of archive making, rather than sort of the traditional archive itself. And so I want to also just throw that there as an opening there a little bit to see what we might be able to think about through that.
Thank you. It's so wonderfully provocative, that meeting. And it's also such a distinct moment. It makes me think about the time I had the privilege of attending a Said lecture at SOAS when I was at university. And I was in the lighting booth at that point of time, trying to arrange it. And it was interesting that as soon as he appeared, he said, well, I don't want to stand on stage. I'd rather be down there with the public. And so he moved and he gave his lecture from the audience, as it were, with the audience. And of course, Edward Said would do something like that at that moment. But of course, looking at the arc of, what you've intimated here from the alignments that occurred, as it were, in artistic production in the 70s and 80s, it makes me think so distinctly about where we are now. And in a way, what just happened a few days ago with reference to the first, as it were, 1 year anniversary of Ukraine and the kind of international alignments that have been forged by the United States at this distinct moment in Russia, and whether the world is once again being polarized so that there's another drive towards that non-aligned idea of demilitarization, and then using, of course, cultural power to think about distinct modes of, addressing embodied traces or narrative excess that comes from that extreme, drive towards armament building, and hence as a consequence, the militarization of spaces for time to come. I think it's a very potent message that one needs to sort of think about and create right now, because at the end of the day, you're right. And I go back to a lot of Foucault all the time, think about those hierarchies that are constantly at play, but also the silences that come into archives at all times. When are silences brought in? Silences can be brought in at the time of the origin or the making of an archive. Silences can be brought in thinking about archives. Silences can be brought in creating the narrative of an archive. And then silences can be engineered in the perception of what archives should do. So many silences can be made. And at this moment in time, I think one has to think about that political consciousness, as Anoli has so brilliantly done in her piece, as you intimate, and what Tirtha stands for. But at all times, it's interesting. I feel that there's also a drive towards the networked image and towards new media requiring new modes of engagement that she brings to the fore. And if you're talking about the question of the hyperlocal, at one point of time, I think in the 50s and 60s, and I think one of the issues I'm constantly confronted with in this volume and volumes that I'm subsequently doing is that not one individual has one meaning for the term modernism or modernity. Virtually everyone in this volume, all 31 pieces, address it very differently and distinctly. Some looking at it in terms of, the coming of sort of colonial and settler colonial identities. Some individuals coming to it from the making of modern nation states, some individuals coming to it from the breaking of certain kinds of media into other media. So it's interesting that at all points of times, one is not thinking about, necessarily capturing a movement, but a moment, which is what, the post-digital or the digital was always meant to be framed as. And I find that a distinct thing to bring up, with the idea of the archival and the anarchival, the counter archive, which of course is belied and intimated and in a way upheld by the very notion of the demotic and the hyperlocal, as Chris Binney would call it. How our practices in one sense, and I really take this from him, how our practice is more than local but less than global. And that distinct moment of, being proliferated into new spaces, and how does one sort of think about them by bringing them back to the place of their so-called origin, but then they are never there, they keep changing. And hence, all of these distinct moments in time, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, were also times of great subversion, I feel. One distinct article I wrote, which was more a review of an exhibition, was thinking about the subversive press, which Pragya Dhittal had done an extraordinary exhibition on at SOAS last year. And she identified distinct newspapers, as it were, that were, subversive and secretly being passed around, or newsletters that were being passed around, such as Damn You in, the 1980s, I think it was. But a lot of them very much followed, well, actually, I think even earlier, it was in the 70s, because somewhere it coincided with the emergency. And she had these fascinating letters and telegrams from an individual who was incarcerated for actually putting his views out there to the public and who defended himself. I think his name was Tripathi. And there's a distinct part of that archive of telegrams that she puts forward. But effectively, what the subversive press is telling us is that also there was at distinct moments media that supported it, technology that supported it. And so hand in hand with the development of, as we go about theorizing locality and looking at dissenting or complicit positions, we have to realize how interestingly the image has been a privileged operator going across technology throughout its time, and hence is able to go beyond, a certain kind of critique to an extent, but is also, because for every image there is a counter image. For every discussion around, the production of syncretic legacies, which I think, Tanzim Wahab and Nayantara and Hamad deal with so distinctly in the volume of the reader. At any point of time, there are syncretic legacies. One has to realize there's also a shared intelligence. And when both of those are there, and this is something with reference to the hyperlocal, there's also digital democratization. But at all times, when one is confronted with digital democratization, there are two pitfalls to this. One, that actually digital culture and digital awareness is not in the hands of everyone that one imagines it to be. It is not as pervasive as we imagined it to be. And you could always see this at the time of the lockdown when, lower income families were asked to go to school on their cell phones, and none of them either had a cell phone that was an Android, or even if they did have it, they might not know how to sort of deploy and use it. And the other problem of course, digital democratization is about a sense of proprietorship. It allows those who have a voice to actually overrepresent themselves very, very often. And so what happens to the local voices that are being represented that don't have digital technology, but whose voices are reliant on being put out based on certain individuals who are there? Now, this is going to be a fact of history. This is something that has always been the case with any media that has come out. It's been the case with, literary awareness in the 18th century when the first newspaper came out in South Asia, which was the Bengal Gazette. But it coincided with the Vernacular Press Act that disallowed local papers to come out in their own languages. because they couldn't be read by the settlers. So in a way, there's a 250-year, I think, discussion around questions of hyper-nationalism, hyper-localism, but also, transcultural censorship that has occurred, and also distinct ways in which that has been countered at all times. And this is exactly what makes that question of the archive, Mala, which you intimated, come alive. There is a livingness to this archive. There is that effective quality to archives. They're not just silent entities, that they're so dynamic in what they might, put forth. Is that, again, this question of how can the archive be a place of repair? How can it be a place where there's constant, debate around what they might tell us should always be up in the air, I suppose, at one level.
So go. Sorry. It's all good.
No, if I can also just, I think as I respond to, I think, Rahaab, what you were sort of speaking about. I mean, I was really struck by some of this sort of, it reminded me a lot of what you were saying, this kind of place of repair is what Azule talks about, the right to go back. But then also, what does it mean for something to also be returned in a different context and for it to lose its cosmology in which it's gained its meaning? And that really makes me kind of sort of, and it's also comes across in many of the essays in this book, which is the image as the operator, particularly. And even sort of moving away from this notion of digital democracies, but much more rather, I think I'm struck by what when you think about Agamben and who can speak, I'm also struck by how does that speaking happen and how does the image become that kind of operator for that kind of speaking. And I think what I'm really struck by here is what Jack Halberstam refers to as the silly archive, and how an archive or the sort of the thing that is dismissed as not worthy of the archival or critical gaze, and to rely on it so wholeheartedly that it does not allow for pause. It does not allow for it sort of something being read or turned into proprietary kind of ownership, but rather becomes sort of this perpetual resistance to any type of border in and of itself. So the same borders that art history or traditional archives themselves tend to succumb to and emerge out of it, all of a sudden you have TikTok videos, Instagram stories, or other forms, whether that be posters or sort of culture that is perhaps seen as low culture, how that feeds into kind of an opportunity for learning, and the city archive, where there the image becomes an operator in a way that perhaps the more traditional archive cannot fully operate. And then South Asia, in all its complexity, is in many ways a fascinating center for that, right? All you have to do is drive through any of this city streets or anywhere for that matter, and see this kind of silly archive emerge over and over again and replicate itself. And the images that produces continuing to operate and being a means of also moving forward, or as Azule said, opens up the potential for the right to go back in many ways.
What I love about this conversation is it just makes clear how so many of these questions we don't have answers for, and we can't answer, but they open up more and more questions in a way. And I was thinking a lot about, when we thought about archive, the quote that you used, Rahaab, by Akram Zaatari, about how photography archives encourage encounters with new people, but it's also very important to return collections rather than taking them from their owners. And then that goes to the idea that an archive, whether it be digital, whether it be physical, is always curated in a way, it's always selected. There's always, like, be it you, Rahaab, curating the archive at Alkazi, or Sandev, if you're creating an archive for your own artistic practice, you choose what to keep and you choose what not to keep. And I think that's a really interesting moment to kind of think about, how do we actually curate image-based practices? So, I mean, I know that Rahaab has had plenty of experience curating a lot of image practices in festival projects and cultural institutions, but also how does the rise of a photographer curating their own show? Like, how can we think about curating lens-based media in South Asia or about South Asia, away from South Asia, in both the context of Alkazi, but also the context of MMCA Sri Lanka. So I'm very happy for either one of you to start.
Well, as sort of try to address some of that. The idea of artists putting together exhibitions has been really the case since the 19th century with respect to photography. It's not something that is new or distinct. Though, of course, artists curating their own works in group shows and so on and so forth is something that is an interesting way in which I think responsibility is taken and then given. In our more recent context. And there are many exhibitions that of course do this. I think virtually, so many artists from the contemporary have curated shows and so on, but this was certainly the case with societies and salons that were established in the 19th and 20th century, where to an extent, there was a world system already in place. We have to realize that phrases like, the globetrotter came up in the 19th century. And it had a lot to do with the tourism industry to a great extent, but it also had to do with traveling exhibitions. Of course, I'm here in Paris, and it was only at the Grand Palais in the 1870s that there were distinct shows, of course, associated with the colonies, but where images from the subcontinent were shown and shared already. But it makes me think about this world system in the context of, how we begin the reader also with Chris Pinney's sense of what is a global photographic legacy in today's culture, and how do you use a kind of semiotics, as it were, he says, of social place to think about the natural and the real, or the posed, or the pro-filmic, things that come in without one's knowing it. And that is very, very distinctly followed up by cross-media and contemporary reworkings and repurposings of the image associated with a kind of indigenous futurism that some of the artists have brought into their work in the recent past, especially, growing from this notion of vernacular culture. And that has given us, a distinct sense of subversive critique that can be brought into the hierarchies of representation. And it happened in one of the exhibitions, of course, I did put out some years ago, again, collectively called Ephemeral New Futures for Passing Images. But I mean, I think when one comes to that colonial history and archival history, if one looks at it historically, then of course there is this idea of the salvage paradigm. You're taking and selecting from material that is available to you. And so I think there's been a distinct move to go towards personal histories or found material in order to challenge some of the foundations, the classical poetics, of, as it were, bringing exhibitions together. And I think that is very distinct, even when it comes to Ismat Rahim's essay on Sri Lanka, because a great exponent of putting exhibitions across was Lionel Wendt. He was doing it in the 1920s and 30s, not only his own work, but the work of his, of the people around him and so on and so forth. He was as much an image maker as he was an organizer to an extent. And I think that kind of institutionalized, the idea of the institution comes out very, very clearly through also today the Harold Pierce Center and so on and so forth, that I think even till this day houses the Photographic Society of Sri Lanka. But of course, there are, I think, distinct ways in which certain groups associated with photographic societies and what we know as the modern or contemporary art world do not always see eye to eye in terms of their aesthetic and their output. But it brings to light, I think, certain ideas of paradoxes, certain ideas associated with what was the infringement of one person's practice into another person's practice. Where did this idea of copyright actually come about? Or, the free taking and giving of images really come about from? And I think it's interesting that the archive really puts together this question about mass culture, mass media, then becoming, as it were, a semantic subterfuge for many when one is looking at nationalized contexts and subtext. And Sudhir Mahadevan's essay looks distinctly at the idea of copyright in the 19th century in South Asia. What else could I say? I mean, there's much in the volume that addresses this distinctly in terms of new media also. But I think what I was interested in thinking about was, how do you not only think about the production, but the consumption of images at one level, right? How do you think about maybe what Rashid Areen has put across as Afro-Asian legacies and Afro-Asianism at this moment in time? How do we create the basis for multiculturalism in contexts that are sometimes constructs of the post-colonial moment associated with nationhood, right? How does one objectively look at discourse today with the rise of a kind of monolithic, singular sort of news propaganda that is going out? Because it obviously filters into the work of so many of the writers. And the scepter of ambiguity is sort of put out into the public and shared in that distinct kind of way. And I think um, I would really like to sort of acknowledge one particular author in this volume as well, and that is the late Avik Sen, who passed, as we were putting this volume together. And the beauty of what he has to say, and I think his own legacy, which needs to be acknowledged, because I really had the privilege of receiving and being in touch with him regarding his edits just a little bit before. And he talks about the psychic terrain, of human identity. He talks about the etchings of interiority. These are beautiful concepts, and we must not forget that whether there be exhibitions he was referencing, such as Where Three Dreams Cross, or others that have come into the fore, that very notion of the poetics of our place and the idea of never forgetting the lyrical amidst the evidentiary should really be the case with all the cultural work that we do. And I guess to wrap that up, the idea is that maybe the fetishizing of the gaze today, maybe this whole question of the intersubjective and the simulated has to do with a lot about how archives need to perform. The notion of Alex Sakula's, the performativity, the polyphonicness of archives, and how they need to sort of be untethered from, the singularity and the sort of straitjacketing or really the flattening of a history that is happening at this distinct moment. So that commitment, of course, is not any individuals. That is a collective commitment of all arts communities. And this is exactly why I would say that the reader is framed as a reader, because it's looking at so many of these archival traces and contemporary intonations, but not trying to say that this is a compendium or an anthology. It is a reader, and readers can be brought out by anyone in the field, which will give it the focus of that person's position and that person's sort of media engagement. This is very important. I mean, that this is supposed to be a place of inclusion and openness and open-endedness, which I guess with all that has occurred in our recent past should be the commitment of, can be an institutional commitment if one works towards it.
Sandev, do you want to respond? And that might be the last thing we respond to in our little trio, and then we'll open it up for questions.
I think I have to, I'm trying to think about exactly how to respond to some of those points that you brought up. But I think the last thing perhaps I want to more specifically respond to is I was really struck, Rahaab, by what we were talking about when looking at these particular histories, is the infringement of one artist's practice on another. And I think in many ways that, I think, brings me to a place of usurping one part of your question, Mala, which is the curatorial here. When thinking about sort of infringement of one artist practice on the other, I think, Rahaab, you started to think about, you spoke about this kind of discursive, the kind of discursive that emerges in a particular moment, in a particular time, through which then images are produced and sort of conversations continue. And I think that is something that sort of perhaps I think I'm seeing in this in this book too. I think Rahaab, you reference some exhibitions like Growing Like a Tree. This curated by Sohar Abhira. You're also referencing Pop South Asia, and a few other collectives and collective practices that are reckoning with this question of also the curatorial. And I'm wondering also then if perhaps for a second we dismiss the curatorial. And I'm speaking now from a position not in the museum, but as part of the artist collective, and speaking about the Packett's work, I think, where you're sort of having this notion of thinking in public, where you are sharing, whether that be TikTok videos, whether that be things that you are Instagrams and memes and things like that, connected with other pieces of writing and papers and cartoons for that matter. But you're kind of having this conversation in public, and how it works is basically there's an Instagram account, and many folks in the packet have access to it. And what happens is when we're all posting all at the same time, there's this kind of public conversation that's emerging, but none of us know who we're talking to. It is just by virtue of what's around us that we're collecting. And then there's this kind of public conversation emerging that is tying a lot of these kind of connections together. And I wonder perhaps if that's the next step to the question that you had posed, Mala, is there a way in which we move beyond the kind of curatorial or the notion of the collection and more towards the image as operator, but also as discussant or as facilitator, in which it is one part of a multi-image sort of conversation? Sorry, that was a bit vague, but I think I'm trying to think about what does it mean to sort of move from curatorial to sort of perhaps conversation, I think, and for that process to be made public and thought about.
Definitely, and that.
Yeah.
You're on mute.
No, please, Mala, you're on. Yeah.
No, I think that discursive space is hugely important, and it's something that we're definitely moving into. And even like the traditional roles of the curator or the archivist, it doesn't really mean anything anymore. We're all wearing many hats and playing this conversation game between us all. And going back to that first question, really about the notion of this like discursive practice of South Asia and belonging, I think is really, I mean, I don't think we've resolved any questions in our talk, but I definitely think we've opened up many more, and I know that I will definitely be thinking around them. Rahaab, did you have you wanted to say one more thing, or before we open?
Yeah, I mean, no, thank you for that, generous thought, because it's one of the other exhibitions I don't reference enough, also because, this volume had to go to press. And one had to have a cutoff period, but of course it speaks to the moment from which it was cut off. But there's this fascinating exhibition on partition by Murtaza Wali, of course, at the Jameel Center, which was looking at, proposals for a memorial to partition. And I think I found that also quite an interesting way to, that moment coincided with the book going to press. And it sort of made me think about, I mean, what's intimated by what you're saying is there's also a moment in which the digital has become a kind of reflex for us, where sort of interacting and circulating testimony has become pervasive at a time of a kind of geopolitical upheaval. And especially at the moment where there is so much in the gray area that lies between the filtered and the unfiltered, the proximal and the distant, the firewalled and the free. And, how does one create an open-endedness to one's transformed experiences in this digital world, especially when the nature of contemporary spectatorship has to do with, quote unquote, the explosion of the gaze. It has to do with dispersion as well as recursion. It has to do with, material and, as we intimated earlier, psychological repercussions that are taking place in direct and indirect ways, in which all of us are brought to bear as witnesses of an event, as witnesses to change, as witnesses, and I think these simultaneous questions about addresser and addressee, about producer and recipient, or the producer as now a maker, will always, I think, find new articulation in the cyberspace through which a lot of our discussions are able to reach one another. And I think as long as we have, certain regimes that control that as the fourth estate, we need to create, the counter memory to much of what is out there. And I think that commitment is always interesting for us. And it's going to obviously come at some cost. It's going to come at the risk that one will take of being institutionalized at time. At one point of time, to think in an interdisciplinary way was thought to be outside the institution, but so many institutions have now already made this part of their working, and part of their interior thinking. Is that the question is, how does it evolve into another space, that one is going to create through one's production and through one's practice. And I think that, I guess what I'm trying to say at the end of it, there will always be the deferral of meaning with what one is confronted with, either from the curatorial point of view or from the exhibitionary point of view, or indeed from how one is writing about art histories right now. And I find, in this case, Shahidul's piece where he's actually talking about how to get out of the gallery into the street to be distinctly important vis-a-vis with respect to what you are saying, is that the curatorial commitment is really a collective one. It isn't in isolation to a lot of the other practices that are either trying to frame or, in this case, unframe. And this is why the 5 sections in the reader are also trying to tell this distinct art history of the image through very tangential, peripatetic, and episodic, if not, almost erratic sort of strains, so that one can sort of stand a little outside the extremely canonized sense of the art history that has been given to us already. And of course, it will come at the cost of this reader being seen and perceived as its own institutionalizing, maybe, I hope not, instrumentalizing of a certain kind of, leftist position, which, if it does do, will be something that has happened somewhat consciously and somewhat subconsciously. But at all times, I think, one is trying to get out of the mode of thinking about the event to thinking about the moment. And this is something I take distinctly from so many authors who have talked about the distinction between something that you put out there, this moment, which is the moment of being, as opposed to what lies in the future, which is the moment of becoming. And so hopefully it can, maybe curatorial practice too can serve that purpose of becoming something in time that it currently hopes and aspires to do.
Thank you so much. I think that's like a beautiful end point for our talk, and I think a really, really great introduction to the reader, which I hope our audience, and I know I will be getting a copy, to kind of explore everything that we've managed to speak about in this very, very fruitful hour. I wanted to open up the floor to questions. I won't keep the audience too long, so we'll only take a few, but if you do have any, please do put them in the chat and we can speak to them.
And while we wait, I was going to ask Sandev what is in store for the Center for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sri Lanka. Can you tell us a little more about it and the processes that you're going through or thinking about? Because I found that has, distinct, as it were, messages, as it were, with respect to how institutional building is something of the present. It's something has to be envisioned and embodied in one sense in terms of the histories that we're looking at. So please, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Rahaab. Yeah, I'd be happy to kind of give you something brief. But yes, the Museum of sort of Modern and Contemporary Art, we're a new institution, opened in 2019. about 70 days before the pandemic sort of hit and shut us down. But we're now in our sort of second exhibition that's been up for the year, and we're in the last month of that kind of exhibition. The first exhibition was curated by Shamini Pereira, which is looking at this sort of, in many ways, Rahaab, I think a similar approach to this kind of, it's not a compendium, it's trying to think about sort of cosmological, if you will, touch points to what could be perhaps not necessarily an art history, but stories about art in Sri Lanka from the 1920s to the present. So it's sort of a zooming in. And then the second exhibition was looking at sort of bringing this sort of more modern works into conversation with sort of contemporary. And that obviously throws up all of the questions about what exactly modernism or the modern is. And the third exhibition, I think this is where perhaps the museum is really thinking along sort of right through where it's illustrative of where we are and what we're thinking about. Then the next exhibition, which opens in May, is looking at the idea of the foreigner in all its sort of facets. And I think many of the kind of conversations we're having here today are looking at that show. And so it's a show of contemporary artists, 17 contemporary artists that really start to throw up, and it's kind of our way of trying to think about what it means to make that initial stake in the ground to this sort of larger conversation on exile or territory or spatiality in the context of the island, and then who by negation is also of the island, or by exile is also of the island in many ways. And how does that then create this other in-between sort of space? So those are the kind of more exhibition related. And then we have a fourth exhibition coming later on this year, which is looking at Minette de Silva in particular towards October. But I think primarily one thing the museum is reckoning with is one, just building a back end. We're a new institution, a small institution, trying to think in very basic terms about what does it mean to art handle? What does it mean to, secure loan contracts? And what does it mean to not have a location and be placed in temporary locations until, because what we are in right now is called a silent stage. And then the other thing the museum is also reckoning is what does it mean to approach this kind of history making or this archive making, especially when you don't have a collection, and what does it look like to operate from outside of that? But I think the third, perhaps more larger, I don't know if it's a looming question, but it is definitely around, which is what does it mean to think about, and this is maybe speaking to what you are asking, Rahaab, is what does it mean to think about to build or institution build a museum when museums themselves are starting to question their role on a larger scale elsewhere in the world. And when that comes to, when it comes to just very basic things like climate control and the sustainability of running these kind of hermetically sealed spaces. So these are just some of the larger conversations that the museum in itself is happening. But I think primarily what we are sort of centering on is trying to really think about what does it mean to build an institution in response to or on the backs of multiple other institutions that now have been critiqued and changed, are being forced to change. So one of the big priorities there has been to be education-led and training-led in particular.
Thank you, Sandev, and we're so excited about supporting you from ASAP's end for the Minette de Silva exhibition publication. So very excited to see the shows, and hopefully Team ASAP will be able to go to Sri Lanka soon and visit your silent stage space. We have one question, which we spoke, I'm going to paraphrase, I think, but we spoke a lot about archiving or thinking about curating photography. How did we think about teaching photography in South Asia? Maybe, I don't know, maybe Rahaab, you want to take this question?
Thank you for whomever asked that question. I often think about it with respect to, the little category under which HarperCollins has put this volume, which is called Image Studies. And at one point of time, Rochana Mazumdar, wherever she is at this moment, I have there's just the delight of meeting her last week here in Paris, where she was at the Raza show, but of course as a professor at Chicago University. And it was really her idea at one level to start courses on image studies with the University of Delhi at one point of time. And this, of course, got shelved because of COVID. But I think it provides an interesting sort of way of addressing a kind of growing, as Sandev intimated, on the one hand, regional consciousness, because after all, one doesn't need to always take a position, but have a consciousness of space and spatiality, and a consciousness about, what are the practices that are around. And if that eventually allows you to think in a more, socially engaged way, then that's good. But I think it's one way to tackle any kind of, regional discourses, to think about sort of prominent visual valences and cultural valences as a result that have emerged from there, to put in a nutshell. So I'm hoping that for curricula, that, this volume goes in the direction of trying to help institute something of, a South Asia image-related curricula, or South Asia image-related department. I know this is not only of my thinking, I'm kind of filtering the thinking of so many people in the field, not least of all, someone who I met recently, Nada Raza, who's at the Alkazi Foundation as well. And I think so this collective commitment to building some kind of, I would say, a pedagogical or even a parapedagogical framework, which is not overtly institutionalized, but, has the way of being drawn on, guest speakers and guest lecturers coming and giving their takes, whether it be artists, curators, writers, and so on. I think that will go in a certain way of eventually making, somewhat of a department. And of course, there is certainly one department of South Asia, which is that I know of in the region. But I think it's deserving to be in virtually every place within South Asia, should have a South Asia department that is networked to the other. And I also want to thank Sasanka Pereira and his publication, from which Anoli's piece was taken, and then, of course, updated a little bit. But this commitment has been out there for a long time. And I think it needs to be galvanized a little more right now. And I think maybe we're on the precipice, on the verge of doing something of that nature. But just to say, just the making of a new field or area studies will help filter a lot of what remains latent or outside current curricula.
Thank you, Rahab. And I know when we've spoken about the reader, this is really what you're trying to create, that curriculum, or support that curriculum through this creation, which wasn't the exact form that it is before. I think we'll probably take this last question from Mansi. When disassociating from the anthropological, which is still a strong philosophy for minority communities in India, how do indigenous image makers, who were also in a way born in exile, not simply overcome the gaze, but be seen as and heard as South Asian? Maybe Sandev, if you want to start this, and if Rahab has has an answer as well, he can continue.
I mean, thank you. I think that is a sort of really brilliant and pertinent question. I think I'm going to stall a little bit and just pay attention to something towards the end of that question that is written so well. So thank you, Mana, which is, how do indigenous image makers, again, in a way born in exile, not simply overcome the gaze, but be seen and heard as South Asian? And I can maybe reflect here in the sense of that I'm simply reflecting, that I'm spitballing. But as a practitioner, I think what has been helpful is to think through this notion of speaking from, and I know Rahab may have heard this multiple times, as the packet tends to repeat this quite often, but to to think particularly instead of adapting the place of speaking to, needing to speak to the kind of sort of reporting from the third world or reporting from a particular locale or territory, but to speak from it. And in that speaking from, to almost, if you will, deny access to the specificities of the context in which you are speaking from. What is important, I think, to go back to Agambe here, is that the speaking is coming from a particular position of particular kind of internality. One of the ways a packet negotiates this is we always talk about speaking from the point of intimacy and playfulness, and what happens when that becomes sort of a way to refuse the kind of anthropological gaze, to be the kind of reporters or the kind of representation, people who represent a particular locale to the rest of the world, because then that is taking on the ethnographic lens. And I think that's why I go back to this notion of the hyperlocal, to dive into the hyperlocal and speak from it. And one of the approaches we use is intimacy and playfulness, and just seeing what emerges from there, this kind of defiance and this refusal to kind of speak in a way that is required, perhaps, by kind of powers that be. But also, I think perhaps and this is perhaps this is just a bit of a speculation, but to think about actually to refuse to be seen as South Asian, in that to be refused to be seen as terrestrial in your sort of spatial kind of locations and the politics that go with it, but simply to take on the role of perhaps the artist who just chooses to speak because they need to speak, if that makes sense. I understand that also means perhaps a question about legitimacy and where the voice is emerging from, but that's perhaps where I go to, which is again the hyperlocal, and how the hyperlocal can be a place of refusal, including the kind of anthropological or the reportage that is often expected of minority or indigenous communities.
Thank you for that, extremely pertinent question, and Sandev for that response. I don't think he was stalling at all. It was really just filtering the sheer, the notion that this is something that has been pertinent and persistent for a very, very long time. I'll speak to it a little bit from, again, the ongoing exhibition that is here at the Pompidou, which has an interesting sort of metaphor, if one may call it that, or just sort of a line of sight, which is one of the distinct things that I picked out about Raza's father was that he came to meet Veria Elwin, the anthropologist, at one moment in time in Madhya Pradesh. And this is, of course, in the 1930s, I think, distinctly. And of course, Veria Elwin, who was an anthropologist, then a Gandhian, literally in that order. But at that point of time, I think from the pre to the post-colonial, there was a huge refrain towards questions of primitivism and indigenism, the idea of a political fantasy and the notion of a cultural project, and how there are certain cultural signifiers that allow us to think about it. Now, taking that moment to what Subhash Thebe does now, which is Adivasi futurism, and thinking about how digital cultures are deployed by quote unquote indigenous communities, allows one to think or rethink the very question of the nation building project at this moment in time. And I think there are various institution or institutionalizations that have occurred even from the pre to the post, such as, for instance, Shanti Niketan, which thought of this idea of Pan-Asianism for artists who are coming there from all communities, right? It happened to an extent also within art schools in India, maybe one of which was, in metropolitan centers like the JJ school, but very, very distinctly. But it also happened through other individuals who wrote poems about them, such as Octavio Paz in the 1960s, who came down as the Mexican ambassador over here. So I guess the question of indigenism for me then gets melded up with still the question of modernism and internationalism, because it doesn't only remain the place of the hyperlocal, it has been a pivot for discussions around art and the questionings around identity from the very beginnings of the writing of art history, as a matter of fact. And I think it's important to remember that, because a lot of diasporic writing also takes from this, very notion of what is the local, the hyperlocal, the here and, and the there. And I think when we look at it from the point of view of what we are confronted with today, again, questions of subductions of contemporary practice, whether they have to do with, insurgencies or invasions, ongoing occupations. I think the commitment again is to see these as living sites, is not just discursive sites. And you're right. I mean, how is that going to be heard is a commitment that has to come both from institutionally, para-institutionally, and individually. But many, many artists are now deploying, and thinkers are now deploying digital means to sort of counter a lot of what's out there. So because media is in everyone's hands, they are being galvanized into groups that form and find representation and organize and thereby resist. Of course, I've just given you one example of Subhash Thebe. If you haven't seen his work, please do have a look at it, because I think it's at one level very, very timely, because it talks about fraught geographies. It talks about infrastructures of extraction, as it were, but it also talks about embedment and speaking from the ground.
We had one more question, but it depends on you both. We could ask it. It's quite similar to the question we just had. So shall I read it to you? And if we have tiny comments, and then we can try and wrap up at past. So we'll have quite short answers on it. So this is from Naz. Given the extremely mapped and diverse and complex nature of South Asian cultures, do you think that open-endedness posits a challenge to address the narratives of particular areas, regions, and communities? Like, we might have covered this a little bit in our very open-ended conversation, but maybe this is something, if you both wanted to add a little short answer to that. Yeah, go, Rob. You're on mute.
Sorry, I said Sandev, please.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, throwing me under the bus here very quickly. I think I think about coalition a lot, and I think about how the kinds of coalitions of solidarity, of kind of identifying, but also disidentifying as a form of identifying, becomes a very sort of resistive or liberatory strategy. And I think about, first of all, the kinds of things that one might disidentify from, and to disidentify from sort of colonial or contemporary biopolitical conceptions of South Asia, or the nations that make them up, or the identifiers that make them up, doesn't necessarily, I think, automatically mean open-endedness. In fact, I feel like sometimes it can be perceived as the opposite, which is that you dive so deep into what is the world of your community, and you strengthening of speaking from that voice actually doesn't make it as open-ended at all. It actually makes the coalition more specific. The coalition that's built more tethered through specificity, and tethered through more specific and grounded solidarities. Sort of, I'm also answering the sort of question of indigeneity and being seen, or legibility as a South Asian, and also answering maybe this question of open-endedness. I'm not sure if exactly open-endedness is the direction. Perhaps that is what it might look like at certain points, but it might be the opposite, actually.
Thank you, Sandev.
Yeah, thank you. And well, I to take on, I think I join Sandev in, in the concerns. And, it's always salutary to have open-endedness as a premise. I think we're talking, one looks at it in a very circumspect way at this moment, because we are in, as it were, the post-truth mass media world of a new ethos, where there are so many vortexes of alternative facts that are put before us. One doesn't know how to find a singular commitment necessarily at all times. And sometimes you feel that the genealogies and the lines of sight that you're, putting out there are somewhat frayed. They don't hold up. They're not empathetic enough. They don't allow you to so easily move between and to each other's imaginary, which is where we should be at one level. So at the same time, I think one should be very positive and productive in thinking about how far we have moved, and audaciously we have moved away from, as it were, the imperial panopticon and the hegemonizing, right? We are able to speak, we are able to counter. We must never forget, I suppose, that. And one doesn't need to have the illusion of, omniscience or omnipresence as the framework beyond and before which we always speak. That is to say, open-endedness becomes very, very important. But how will one arrive at, as institutions like contemporary art in Sri Lanka are trying to do, is to arrive at somewhat eloquent new cartographies, a new atlas of time, to think about image practices and to think about, those meta relationships, which are so much part of South Asian visual culture, again, even though they're not only part of South Asian visual culture, that those have to be mixed with not just virtual journeys that we take across to one another, but actual journeys and actual encounters that we must make with one another. And I think maybe what we can extend your sense of open-endedness to is the challenge of having to do that and making that part of our practice, making part of our practice not only to experiment, but to experience, and how to innovate, with one another through various open-ended archival, curatorial, editorial experiences that one can generate for and with one another. And I guess I'm saying it in this way because the idea of the notion of an image culture always comes with the idea of re-envisioning and revisiting what is already out there. How else can we do it but together?
That's a really beautiful, beautiful ending phrase. Both of you have wonderful poetic turns of phrase. I think I'm going to definitely take home this idea of the coalition and the Atlas of Time. Really, really beautiful ways of putting the kind of wrestling with the complexity of everything that we've spoken about today. Thank you so much, Sandev and Rahab, for your generous time. I'm kind of jealous of the audience because I want to go back and listen to this, and I can. But I really wanted to thank you both, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you didn't manage to catch the whole thing, or you have friends who really wanted to join, this will be available on YouTube and our website in the coming weeks. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye and have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.